some of the research that we've examined around climate education and emotions, and some insights and also some specific examples of how, some really creative ways actually to support youth with coping with challenging climate emotions and climate anxiety. And then we'll move into the activity in the breakout groups that Shadia shared a little bit about earlier. So I want to share some context. I imagine many of you have some understanding of the climate crisis, some concern around it, and some understanding of where Canada sort of fits in here. But just a little bit of this context that I wanted to provide before sharing some of my findings in recent research. So Canada is warming at 2 times the global rate, of course, warming in the far north, happening faster than other parts of the country. Some of us, and I like to use this term, talk about Canada as a colossal fossil. So this was actually a name given to, Canada was named a colossal fossil in one of the earlier COP events. I actually forget which number it was now, but I think this name is still very fitting, and there are a set of reasons why. So we can look at greenhouse gas emissions per capita in Canada, and we're among the worst globally, certainly in the top 10, depends what metrics we're using. Our nationally determined contribution and our commitments have been assessed as severely lacking or largely insufficient, according to the organization Climate Action Tracker. Our federal government has a terrible track record of missing every single climate target that we have set as a country. That doesn't give us a lot of hope for progress in the near future. And particularly disconcerting, Canada and the federal government continues to advance fossil fuel extraction and extractivism, production and export, particularly of crude oil, while providing all sorts of subsidies at the tune of billions of dollars in tax breaks and financial supports to the fossil fuel industry. So colossal fossil in a number of ways. So we know that climate change is a threat to physical health. There's decades of really strong research showing the range of ways in which climate change has consequences for health. Really only in the last decade or 15 years, we're starting to see the research grow, illustrating climate change is a serious threat and risk to mental health and well-being. And this is moving quickly. This research field is really advancing very quickly. Every week there's a new sort of important study to read and to get on top of. So this is advancing quickly. So we also are seeing evidence that young people are disproportionately impacted when it comes to mental and emotional health impacts around the climate crisis. And of course, very concerningly, a real intergenerational injustice, young people have contributed the least to the crisis. Even though the research field is moving quickly and advancing rapidly, there are a whole set of really concerning research gaps, which are, of course, leading to a whole set of really concerning practice and action gaps in this space of mental health, climate change, and youth, young populations in particular. So a little bit more in terms of context. So the research that I'm presenting about today is a project called Climate Anxiety Among Young People in Canada, a National Survey. And so this was very much inspired by an important study that was published in 2021. Hickman and Al, Hickman is the lead author. And so this study was called Climate Anxiety in Children and Young People and Their Beliefs Around Government Responses to Climate Change, a Global Survey. And so this study was very influential in the field and also really garnered a lot of attention from the media and practitioners and nonprofit organizations. So there's a lot of discussion around this study. So Canada was not one of the countries included in this work. And so my colleague and I, Dr. Ellen Field, thought, we really should have Canadian data as well to start to understand these trends and fill this gap in terms of Canadian specific data around young people and climate emotions and climate anxiety. So the purpose of this study, the purpose of our work was really to generate knowledge and baseline knowledge around climate emotions and climate anxiety among young people aged 16 to 25 across the country. And we wanted to do this, as I said, so we could start doing some global comparison work, but also so that we could have a baseline to monitor longitudinal trends moving forward. And in addition to replicating the work that Hickman and Al did so that we could do this comparative work to other global settings and have an understanding around Canada in relation to global contexts, we also expanded the work that was done by Hickman et al. To specifically ask questions to gather youth perspectives around coping, so supports, programs, and resources to support coping with challenging climate emotions and climate anxiety, and also some ideas about movement and progress in the formal education system. So here's some of the key information that I wanted to share around methods and limitations. Goodness, I hope I don't lose my voice. I had no voice last week. I can feel it already starting to get weaker. But so in terms of our methods, so this was a random representative survey sample. And so our survey instrument had 15 questions. So the Hickman and Elle study that we replicated from included 7 questions. So we added 8 more. And so our sample was 1,000 youth aged 16 to 25. And so our data were collected at the end of February into March, and it was administered in both English and French. Our data were weighted importantly by age, gender, and region, so they're representative of our Canadian population according to census data on those key factors. And so in terms of analysis, we ran a whole set of descriptive analyses and also some scales. And we also asked a number of open-ended questions. So those are textual answers that respondents provided that we analyzed with emergent thematic coding. And so as I move forward and start sharing some of the findings, you'll also see that I'm including actually voices from youth through direct quotes. And that's a parallel study that we're running that's ongoing right now, where we're actually interviewing youth and also adults as well across the country around their lived experiences of mental and emotional impacts and dimensions of climate change. So I wanted to bring in some of those lived experiences and stories. So you'll see some of those quotes throughout. And just to share some of the limitations that I think are important to sort of keep in your mind as I share some of the findings. This is, of course, cross-sectional data, so we aren't able yet to show trends. We're not able to speak to causation or causality. Our findings are self-reported, so we administered a survey and youth reported their own thoughts and experiences in relation to the questions that we asked. What's presented here is, of course, interpreted through my lens and through my sets of biases. I am a able-bodied white adult, and so that certainly is important to recognize when thinking about the results that we're sharing and also our interpretation of our findings as well. Also, I think relevant, certainly Sadia has shared that a number of educators are joining us today, which is great, but our findings are not necessarily generalizable to the younger age group, so below 16 years of age, representative of 16 to 25-year-olds. And in our questions, when we asked about government role and influencing thoughts, perspectives, and experiences among youth, we specifically asked about the federal government. We did that so that our survey instrument could be specific. However, it's important, I think, to recognize that, of course, the federal government I like to point my finger at the federal government, but all levels of government really have a lot of work to do in terms of swift, transformative, urgent action to address this emerging mental health crisis among youth. So in terms of the findings that I'm going to share, I'll share a little bit about these experiences. Again, this government inaction in relation to climate anxiety, and then also sharing about climate change education and coping. So the first thing that we wanted to hear about and that we asked about was, does climate change make you feel any of the following? And so what we see is that there really is a set of diverse emotions that young people are reporting when it comes to climate change. And I've highlighted this set at the top. So these are the most common. So feeling afraid, feeling sad, anxious, helpless, powerless, and angry. So what we argue in our paper, and this is in alignment with emerging sort of growing consensus in the literature, is that it's this set of emotions that are characterizing experiences of climate anxiety among youth. And in particular, when we look at some of the emerging work comparing adults and youth, this powerlessness dimension is really important among young people who both feel powerless and oftentimes are, based on lack of opportunities for engaging in decision-making and influencing policymaking and action around climate change. I also wanted to highlight grief here. So we're seeing a lot of research looking at ecological grief, and particularly among adults. And so this was something that somewhat surprised me, that grief was not as common as some of these other emotions. However, in our interviews, we're seeing this expressed in a diverse set of ways. So one of the things that we want to explore moving forward in some of our other qualitative work is to understand this experience of grief, ecological grief among youth in particular, because we think it's there, it's just perhaps not understood and reported with this language among youth. So here's where I wanted to share some of the words from some young people. So I feel like there's nothing I can do. It's like you're taking 1 teaspoon out of an ocean and thinking you're doing something, but you're not. So this is Elizabeth, age 21, who's sharing this experience of powerlessness or perhaps helplessness when she's thinking about climate change. I feel it's sort of inevitable that climate change is going to destroy the earth. That's Leanne, age 18, passionate to not being able to get out of bed some days because
So I was just wondering if you got any feedback from the youth that participated in your project about how they felt during the project, or if you noticed anything in particular, any differences between like learning outside and learning in a classroom or anything like that?
What a great question. And so would that be environmental education or place-based education as the English, the appropriate sort of approach in terms of what you're thinking about?
Well, it's like it is a form of environmental education, but they specify by learning outside and being open to learn from the environment. So it's not just like one person giving all their knowledge, it's like being open to learn in that space.
Yes, and so I would say that's sort of so we grounded that work in Head Hard's Can's transformative education model and also place-based education. So very similar, I think, very much related approaches to teaching and learning. And so also central to what we were doing was relationship building among the participants and the community groups and organizations that we sort of co-developed and implemented this 7-day intensive field course together, but also the land and the place where we were. So everything that we taught about and engaged with in the Climate Action Field School was grounded in place, grounded specifically in the Lake Superior watershed. And also in the communities where we were working. And so one of the things that we did that was really important, one of the first things we did, we actually got out in a canoe, a 12-person Voyager canoe, and spent, a couple hours together on the lake, seeing the land in a different way. And that really shaped, I think, the experience moving forward. And so we didn't do any evaluative work for the Climate Action Field School. We just didn't have time. We had to pull it together, and we were working with so many people, so we didn't have time to think about and prepare any evaluative work, which was a shame. I would have loved to do so. But we did hear a lot of really, the kind of feedback we heard from our youth participants were that it was unlike anything they'd ever done before. Like, why isn't all education like this? That it was really helpful for them, that work of building relationships with one another and also the land, helped to actually process some of the sort of conflicting, challenging emotions they were experiencing. And also for those of us that were involved in the sort of visioning and design and implementation of the field school, many of us actually shared similar experiences. So again, we didn't measure or monitor that with any specific evaluative tools. I would have liked to, but from what I'm seeing with this work and some other related work is that your hypothesis is very likely. I would not be surprised if your hypothesis is accurate and correct. You feel free to reach out if you have other follow-up questions about that. I'd love to hear more about what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Jimmy?
Thanks. Just something we might say that government is not paying enough attention, like you mentioned, like to solving the problem and investing in solving these things. But sometimes I almost, and it's more like an opinion than a question, but I want to hear you on that. Thinking sometimes they might not really understand the severity of the problem. Do you think it's part of it?
If the government doesn't understand the severity of the problem?
Yeah.
I don't think so. I don't think that's what's going on. I think it's the entrenchment of our extractivist, socioeconomic system and way of even thinking about our country. So, Naomi Klein has some interesting writing showing, our history is grounded in extractivism, and perhaps it's impossible for our politicians to envision or imagine a future that is based in care and taking care of each other and our land. And so I don't have the answers to those challenges, but lack of political will, I think, is also certainly part of it. But this is why I love working with young people and youth. I think that they can help inspire a vision of a future that is grounded in a system of care instead of a system of destruction and extractivism. And from a personal standpoint, for me, for someone who is very well versed in the science of climate, you for the heart, that's lovely. The science and really how scary it can be at times. It is my work with youth and the kind of that set of examples that I showed at the end that really keeps me able to continue to do this work. I think I would not be able to continue to do the work that I do without the motivating and generative and inspiring work with youth, young people in particular.
Thank you, Nicole.
I'm wondering, why is it that you decided to focus on youth in particular? Do adults, you find that adults do not, is your presumption that adults don't suffer from ego anxiety, or is it you just had to start from somewhere?
Yeah, no, not at all. I think absolutely. And so we haven't done any, in part, we wanted to look at youth because this is sort of a research interest of ours and a group population that both Ellen and I, co-author, and I work with and care deeply around. But we've been considering implementing a similar national survey among adult population as well, to sort of start to understand that, as among the experiences among the adult population. So that the interviews that we're doing, the qualitative work that we're doing, we are hearing these lived experiences from adults. And there's some other, so one of the interesting layers that comes in, I think, when thinking about youth experiences versus adult experiences, certainly the power and powerlessness pieces, but also sort of guilt, experiences of guilt. You hear a lot of in the stories that adults are sharing, sort of like, whoa, like my generation and me, and we've just what have we done, and how do we turn this around? And so those experiences we're hearing. So I've been doing the interviews, we just haven't analyzed those yet, but I've been listening to those stories. And so absolutely, adults are experiencing eco-anxiety and climate anxiety. I think there are some differences in terms of the experiences and the intricacies and the nuances of the experiences, but I don't think it's any less relevant. And some of the work that I'm really keen to move forward in is youth, adult, or even elder conversation. So creating safe and accessible spaces to cross these sort of generational boundaries of these experiences to learn. So there's a lot of rich learning across these intergenerational spaces, and addressing this sort of a huge elephant in the room around intergenerational injustices. So I'm not there yet in terms of what that ought to or could or should look like, but maybe some folks here in this space today might have some thoughts or ideas or inspiration for that. Thank you, Nicole. That's a good question.
Audrey?
Yes, hi, thank you. I was wondering, we talked about the youth that was in different regions. I was wondering if saw or analyzed if there was any differences between that was in more like cities and countryside, because I know representation, the relationship can be different. And if you didn't, if you thought about analyzing it in next studies.
Yes, that's exactly one of the places we're looking next. And so I have a sort of hypothesis that there are some really interesting, intriguing distinctions between, I tend to think about rural or urban and then rural, remote, northern, and mid-sized communities as distinct. And one of them, there's a number of key reasons why that's so, but this really important dimension of being able to engage in collective action, engage in sort of restorative work, that in some of our smaller communities, that those spaces, that work is just not there for youth to become involved in. So one of the main ways to sort of process this and cope and support coping just is not there, sort of adequate. And so the interviews that we're doing right now are actually focused on rural, remote, mid-sized communities. So we wanted to look outside urban centers and our large sort of Canadian urban centers. So the lived experiences that I'm seeing and that we'll be moving into in our qualitative analysis are specifically oriented towards that. But I do think I would not be surprised if we analyze some of our survey data. And it starts to get, when you start analyzing, like chopping up your numbers, you start to get into riskier territory in terms of having confidence in your findings. But we are hoping to sort of explore that direction, along with sort of gender and ethnicity as well.
D'autres questions? We have like few minutes for education. Yeah, Max.
Hi, thanks so much for all the information. Great presentation. How do you have any advice for people who may be working with youth, but to try to overcome like our own biases of kind of the doom and gloom of the climate catastrophe, like trying to keep, you mentioned about like the hope in the projects that are happening, but yeah, how do we kind of get over our own fear and guilt and grief and everything while trying to support youth doing transformative work, I guess?
Great question, because we come with our own sort of experiences, lived experiences in this space, for those of us that are paying attention and care. I am open in my, like, I'm vulnerable. I am honest about the struggles that I'm having. I don't have the research evidence to show, that I don't have the evidence to say that that's the best approach. But in my experience of doing this work over the last decade or so, I come at this work as like a full human, as a mom with 3 kids that I truly am terrified about. However, I'm doing, the only way I know how to operate is to roll up my sleeves and try to do something about it. And so it does connect perhaps to this idea of grounded hope. So there's some interesting writing around hope, and maybe that's something you'd be keen to explore a little bit more around, Max. But hope doesn't mean everything's going to turn out just fine. That's sort of blind optimism. Hope means finding your sphere of influence. It means finding those people in your community that allow you to recognize, process, speak around your the lived experiences of your own emotions, which are sometimes dark and heavy, but often move through towards hope and brighter things. So I'm not sure if I totally answered your questions, but perhaps that's, but yeah, so this idea of grounded hope is, recognizing things are not looking, like, I don't think ignoring the reality is helpful either. Young people know what's going on. They're aware of the situation, but for the most part. They need, they need support in learning more and having some more opportunities to explore the range of dimensions of the climate crisis. But they know what's going on, right? And so I think being grounded in both reality and hope is helpful.
Okay. Thanks, Lindsay. Last question. Yeah, Jerry?
Hi, thank you. And yes, echoing others, thanks for the presentation. And it's personally really great to hear that these conversations are more prominent. The question I have is whether anything has come up in terms of from youth responses. I guess they weren't open-ended questions, but I'm curious about whether there was a connection made between climate change and colonialism or the need for reconciliation.
That's so not in our survey. Like surveys are not the right necessary method or process for sort of exploring some of those really challenging sort of spaces of interconnection. But in some of our qualitative work, we are seeing that. Not a lot. So again, we had something like 15 or so young people. And I would say, you know, maybe 4 or 5 went there and sharing their perspectives and thoughts and ideas about the future as well. So I'm not sure. So based on, and so that's, you know, not a whole lot of lived experiences that we're drawing on, but some. And so I would say that some young people are seeing those connections, many are not. But this piece of climate justice, that's sort of a really good entry point. And that was an important entry point for our climate action field school. So a lot of the conversations and work we were doing, both around solutions and actions and understanding impacts as well, were centered in that sort of framing and that perspective of climate justice. So that brings in dimensions of capitalism and colonialism, but also oriented towards, you know, what we want to create, the future we want of justice, of climate justice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lindsay. So now I think you can just stop to share your screen.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Okay.